Chapter 1. Hugh Thompson and My Lai, the pilot who tried to stop a massacre. This chapter tells the story of a man who flew low over a Vietnamese village, saw an atrocity in progress, and chose to confront his own army. In the days, weeks, and decades after March 16, 1968, that decision would make him a hero to some, a traitor to others, and a living witness to how a nation judges its own. Background and context, setting the scene. By early 1968, American involvement in Vietnam had reached a level few in the United States could ignore. The tactics used against an enemy that often blended with the civilian population placed enormous pressure on infantry units, and in many places, the line between combatant and non-combatant blurred in the eyes of exhausted soldiers. The Charlie Company operation into the Song My Lai area began as another sweep in a terrible neighborhood. Pro-Viet Cong, booby traps, and the brutal reality of guerrilla warfare. That setting matters because it shaped how men acted on that day. It doesn't excuse what they did. It explains, in part, the pathology that can emerge under stress. Who was Hugh Thompson? Hugh Thompson was a young Army helicopter pilot. He flew an OH-23 observation helicopter with crewmen Glenn Andrianta and Lawrence Colburn. The OH-23 was a light machine, not a gunship, but the crew had armaments on Andrianta or Colburn's weapons, and crucially, the presence of any aircraft overhead created a moral and practical valve. Pilots could see things ground troops could not, and intervene, sometimes with words, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with emergency radio calls. Thompson had the immediate advantage of aerial perspective, but not the authority to order ground troops around. On March 16, 1968, that advantage became morally decisive. What happened that day? Narrative of events. Charlie Company entered My Lai, cleared houses, and under orders, and under a very particular combat mindset, began killing villagers, children, women, elderly. The mission briefing that morning, according to testimony later, was framed by assumptions that the enemy would be in the village, that civilian movement equaled enemy activity, that anyone fleeing or hiding was suspect. Those assumptions loaded the operation for catastrophe. Thompson and crew saw the slaughter from above. What follows in many accounts and in recorded testimony is extraordinary in its straightforwardness. Thompson radioed his superiors, demanding the troops stop. He blocked the road with his helicopter between waiting soldiers and civilians. He threatened to open fire on American soldiers if they continued to deliberately kill civilians. He organized a small evacuation, forcing some soldiers to stand down, and carried wounded villagers to the hospital zone. For this, he later said he acted from a single conviction. He would not be complicit in the murder of civilians. Immediate institutional reaction and vilification. If you imagine the Pentagon or Field Command as a single entity, you'll miss the complexity. There were commanders, messengers, investigators, and a bureaucratic reflex: deny, delay, downplay. The immediate local reaction from Charlie Company was outrage at being told what to do by an aerial observer. Some soldiers labeled Thompson a traitor for interfering with their mission. Beyond the unit, the Army's initial response moved from confusion to cover-up. Reports were sanitized, photographs were hidden, and the initial stories fed a self-protective narrative.
Why was Thompson vilified? There are multiple interacting reasons. 1. Cultural and group identity. Soldiers in combat zones rely on solidarity. When one person from another unit interferes with operations, the natural reaction is to see that person as disloyal. Thompson's very act, protecting the enemy's civilians against American soldiers, struck at the core of unit cohesion in a combat environment where identity is survival. 2. Institutional self-preservation. Militaries resist stories that make them look weak, inept, or criminal. Blame needed to be contained. Admitting a massacre opened the floodgates to legal, political, and public consequences. 3. Ambiguity of orders. Thompson's intervention raised questions about obedience. Soldiers are supposed to follow orders. When an outsider interferes, it undermines a chain they believed justified their action. If the chain could be questioned, what then of their own culpability? 4. Public perception and political stakes. By the time the story reached wider public view, the Vietnam War itself had become politically toxic. Each incident could become a cudgel in public debate. Some powerful people, politicians and military leaders, had reason to punish leaks or whistleblowing. Investigation, trial, and the longer moral accounting. An investigation eventually occurred. The Army prosecuted Lieutenant William Calley as the primary defendant of the My Lai killings. Calley was convicted of murder, received life, later reduced to house arrest, and the public reaction again fractured along political lines. Hugh Thompson, however, was not prosecuted. Instead, he was subjected to censure from some quarters and derision from others. It took decades for the Army to formally acknowledge his actions as honorable. In 1998, the U.S. Army honored Thompson and his crew for their role in stopping further killings. A formal apology of a kind, but one that arrived long before he had endured slurs, hostility, and a measure of alienation. Human consequences. Stories, details, examples. The human texture of the story is the hardest part. Families of U.S. soldiers who supported their sons' actions saw Thompson as a betrayal. Some veterans threw dead animals at Thompson's home. Newspaper headlines after the initial exposure branded the incident in ways that simplified the complexity. For the Vietnamese survivors, Thompson was an unusual figure. He had saved several lives at the last minute. For Thompson himself, the afterlife was heavy. Recognition came late. Ridicule came early. Moral clarity cost him social comfort. Analysis and comparison. Why was Hugh Thompson judged by some as a traitor despite his moral courage? 1. The wartime psychology of the mainstream. In a war where victory was framed in absolute terms, any internal dissent or interference looked like disloyalty. Thompson's act appeared to break the unwritten social contract. You protect your own people. You don't side with the perceived enemy. Polarization narrows moral vision, only allowing room for tribal loyalty. 2. The politics of secrecy. Governments often criminalize leaks or whistleblowing because secrecy protects operational freedom and political authority. Thompson's actions exposed a failure. Punishing the messenger, socially or legally, is a recurrent strategy. 3. The myth of the heroic soldier. American popular imagination has a narrow definition of heroism: brave, obedient, victorious. Thompson's moral courage didn't map easily onto that image. Instead of firing into the enemy, he argued to stop Americans from firing on unarmed people. That inverted expectation unsettled many. 4. Post-traumatic reactions and projection. Many veterans projected their own guilt, confusion, and trauma onto Thompson. In psychological terms, a person who admits wrongdoing or sees wrongdoing in another is an unbearable mirror. Outcasting the witness is a defense mechanism. Lessons. What this story teaches. The Hugh Thompson story is an object lesson in how societies respond to internal moral challenge. When a hero's act undermines institutional narratives, the initial reaction is often to punish or marginalize the hero. Over time, with distance and additional information, public memory can shift. Thompson ended his life more honored than reviled. But that arc required decades, public attention, and a change in national conversation about Vietnam. The lag between the act and the formal recognition is itself a kind of indictment of how a democracy treats moral accountability in war. Thompson's final years were marked by quieter recognition, awards that arrived late, reporters who finally sought him out, and those saved people whose lives shaped his own. The moment when he aimed his helicopter between American troops and Vietnamese villagers, told his fellow Americans to stop, and then acted to save innocent lives, is one of those moral flashes that forces a country to ask what kind of people it is. America judged him in anger for failing to live up to a narrow loyalty. Later, it judged him more kindly and called him brave. The slowness of that conversion is a central part of the tragedy.
Chapter 2. Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, when a defender of democracy became a traitor in the eyes of the state. This chapter tells of a man who took classified documents and put them into the public square, believing that an informed citizenry is essential to democracy, and then faced the full force of a government determined to stop him. Background and context. What were the Pentagon Papers? The Pentagon Papers were a classified Department of Defense study commissioned in 1967 that documented the history of U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from World War II through 1967. The study revealed, among other things, systematic government misrepresentations to the public and Congress about the scope, risks, and prospects of the war. Daniel Ellsberg, a defense analyst and former government consultant, had access to that study while working at the Rand Corporation. Growing disillusioned, Ellsberg decided the American public deserved to know what the government had hidden. Who was Daniel Ellsberg? Ellsberg was not a public dissident from the start. He was a classic mid-century expert, Ivy League educated, a Cold War national security professional, and someone who had once believed that measured secrecy served the public interest. His transformation into a whistleblower was both moral and political. He came to believe the public had been lied to about the Vietnam War in ways that undermined democracy. What Ellsberg did. Narrative of events. In 1971, Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to several newspapers, most famously the New York Times and subsequently the Washington Post and others. The publication ignited immediate governmental fury. President Nixon's administration sought emergency injunctions and tried to stop the newspapers from publishing further extracts. The Justice Department pursued Ellsberg, eventually charging him under the Espionage Act and several other statutes. The courtroom and public reaction. Trial narrative. The trial of Ellsberg, along with his co-defendant, Anthony Russo, became a national spectacle. The prosecution framed Ellsberg as a traitor who had compromised national security. The defense argued he had acted to inform the public and check government power. The trial collapsed when it was revealed that government operatives had engaged in illegal actions to discredit and intimidate Ellsberg, including attempts to obtain his psychiatric records and an illegal burglary at the office of his psychiatrist, the notorious Plumbers Operation. Judge William Matthew Byrne dismissed the case in 1973 on grounds of governmental misconduct and illegal evidence gathering. Why many saw Ellsberg as a traitor. Analysis of vilification. Ellsberg's vilification came from several intersecting fears and political motives.
National security framing. The government claimed the leak endangered lives and operations, a claim that triggers deep, visceral reactions and justifies extraordinary measures in the public imagination. Political polarization. The early 1970s were politically charged. Anyone who undercut the war effort or appeared to do so risked the label anti-American in some quarters. Breach of trust. Ellsberg had been entrusted with classified material. To leak it was to break an oath and a professional norm, an action many in government and the public saw as betrayal of duty. Institutional self-defense. Like militaries, civilian institutions protect their authority. Punishing a whistleblower deters others. The legal pursuit of Ellsberg served an institutional purpose beyond his personal prosecution. Comparisons with other cases, parallels, and differences. Ellsberg's case has become a template for future debates about whistleblowing. Compare Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning or minor leakers in other agencies. Ellsberg was different. He was a high-level insider, and he leaked it to major newspapers rather than to the internet. The Nixon administration's attempts to suppress the press led to a Supreme Court decision, New York Times Company versus United States, that reinforced press protections. Yet Ellsberg personally paid a price. He became a polarizing figure, reviled by some, celebrated by others. The institutional reaction made him a cautionary tale for would-be truth-tellers. Moral and political analysis, what the case reveals. Ellsberg's story forces a choice between two competing goods, the value of secrecy for national security versus the value of transparency for democratic accountability. Ellsberg believed the government had repeatedly substituted secrecy for honesty, and thus had forfeited the trust that justified secrecy. The legal chaos and misconduct by Nixon's operatives validated in the public eye Ellsberg's claim that the state was misusing secrecy. Human consequences, the personal toll. Ellsberg's life never returned to the private anonymity he once enjoyed. He became a public speaker, an object of litigation, and an icon. The personal cost included the strain of prosecution, the shadow of being labeled a traitor, and the challenge of living with the weight of a very public role. He also, however, contributed to a national conversation that changed public law. The press's victory in publishing the papers was a turning point for journalistic freedom in the United States. Lessons and parallels to Thompson, why America judges its heroes. Ellsberg's case echoes Thompson's in one crucial respect. Each challenged an institutional narrative, and each was punished in the short run for that challenge. The difference is method and position. Thompson was a field actor who intervened to stop immediate killings. Ellsberg was a high-level insider, and he leaked to major newspapers rather than to the internet. Both acts forced the public to choose between institutional loyalty and moral truth. Both acts made their actors unpopular with those who equated loyalty with silence. Concluding vignette. Ellsberg later reflected that he had been willing to risk his freedom to awaken civic debate. That the government tried to treat him as a criminal illustrated, he said, how serious the threat to democratic accountability can be when secrecy hides political decisions. The court's dismissal vindicated him legally, but not always socially. To many Americans, he remained a controversial figure. To later generations of activists and journalists, Ellsberg is a model of principled whistleblowing.
Chapter 3. Billy Mitchell. The airmen court-martialed for telling uncomfortable truths. The story of William Billy Mitchell is a century older than My Lai and the Pentagon Papers, but it shows the same pattern. A soldier who spoke truths the institution resisted, punished him, and only later did history recognize the accuracy of his warnings. By the early 1920s, Mitchell, a brigadier general in the U.S. Army Air Service, was already a polarizing figure, widely admired by some and deeply resented by others. His warnings about the future of warfare were clear, unflinching, and for many of his contemporaries, profoundly unsettling. He claimed that air power would dominate modern conflict, that the age of battleships was ending, and that complacent leadership risked the security of the United States. These claims were not made in private or academic circles, but in public forums, congressional hearings, and widely circulated speeches. In hindsight, his words seem prophetic, yet in his own time, they made him an enemy of the military establishment, a man whose talent and foresight were overshadowed by his unyielding willingness to confront authority. The consequences for speaking his mind would culminate in a court-martial that shook the nation and became a defining moment in the history of American military aviation. World War I had already transformed the character of warfare, but its lessons were unevenly understood. The battlefield was no longer a static landscape of trenches. The sky had become a new and critical frontier. Airplanes, once a mere curiosity, were proving their tactical and strategic potential. Mitchell, a West Point graduate and decorated veteran, had witnessed this transformation firsthand. During the war, he distinguished himself not only as a capable officer, but also as a keen observer of the emerging art of aviation. He became a fervent advocate for the independent use of air forces, arguing that airplanes could strike deep into enemy territory, destroy supply lines, and even sink warships. His ideas were radical in the context of the U.S. military of the 1920s. The prevailing orthodoxy still placed ultimate faith in the battleship, the infantry, and the cavalry. To suggest that a relatively new technology like the airplane could overturn long-standing hierarchies and doctrines was, to many, borderline heretical. Mitchell's proposals were not abstract musings. He sought to institutionalize air power, to create an independent air service with its own doctrine, strategy, and budget. He argued that failure to do so would leave the United States vulnerable in any future conflict. This advocacy brought him into repeated conflict with entrenched military hierarchies, particularly the Navy, which saw the airplane as a threat to its supremacy on the seas. Mitchell's advocacy went beyond speeches and internal memos. He conducted demonstrations and experiments to prove his points. Yet his style, blunt, confrontational, and public, alienated potential allies. Those who might have supported his ideas were often unwilling to do so openly, fearing the wrath of senior officers and the political establishment.
Mitchell was not a man who would temper his message for the sake of decorum. In public speeches and congressional testimony, he condemned senior officers for what he called dereliction of duty. He warned that the United States' lack of preparedness in the air would lead to catastrophic consequences. His attacks on the Navy were particularly incendiary. Following the 1923 crash of the airship Shenandoah, Mitchell publicly accused naval leaders of negligence, claiming that rigid adherence to old doctrines endangered lives. He argued that aircraft could sink battleships, a statement many senior officers dismissed as absurd. To prove his point, he organized bombing demonstrations against captured German vessels and obsolete ships. These exercises were more than theatrical. They were direct challenges to established military thinking. Mitchell's rhetoric was sharp, his language unforgiving, and he did not hesitate to publicly accuse top officers of incompetence. In the hierarchical culture of the military, where respect for rank is paramount, this was intolerable. Publicly undermining superiors was seen as a violation not just of protocol, but of the very essence of military discipline. By 1925, the War Department concluded that Mitchell's conduct could no longer be tolerated. He was charged with conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. The case against him argued that his public statements and attacks on senior officers had undermined confidence in the military and humiliated those in command. The charges, while framed in terms of discipline, were deeply intertwined with politics and institutional conservatism. The court-martial was a dramatic, highly publicized affair. Newspapers followed every development, portraying Mitchell alternately as a reckless troublemaker and a visionary. Crowds gathered outside the courtroom, eager to witness the proceedings, while debates raged across the country about the proper role of air power and the limits of dissent within the armed forces. During the trial, Mitchell defended himself vigorously. He stressed that his warnings were grounded in military necessity, not personal ambition or vanity. He cited statistics, described the results of bombing demonstrations, and detailed the lessons of World War I to argue that ignoring air power would leave the nation vulnerable. At one point, he noted that battleships could no longer be considered invincible in the face of aerial attack. He emphasized that technological change demanded adaptation and that failure to adapt would have disastrous consequences. The court, however, was not persuaded by his arguments. The verdict was decisive. Mitchell was found guilty
and suspended from active duty, effectively ending his military career. The sentence was severe but symbolic. The military sought to reaffirm the primacy of hierarchy and obedience over the potentially disruptive influence of a single, albeit brilliant, officer.
To understand why Mitchell was punished, it is necessary to examine the dynamics of institutional authority. His case illustrates a recurring pattern in hierarchical organizations confronted with internal criticism. First, the tone and method of dissent mattered greatly. Mitchell did not confine his critique to private channels. He publicly attacked his superiors, exposing what the military perceived as a vulnerability and embarrassment. Military culture prizes discipline, loyalty, and respect for the chain of command. Public dissent was treated as betrayal, even when the content of that dissent was correct. Second, the broader context of technological disruption heightened the stakes. The military of the 1920s faced the challenge of integrating new technologies like airplanes, which threatened established doctrines, budgets, and career paths. Mitchell's insistence on radical change was inherently destabilizing. Finally, his personality amplified the conflict. He was politically clumsy and abrasive, limiting the number of allies who could support him openly. Institutions often punish those who are both correct and socially offensive, because removing the person restores a sense of order, even if the underlying ideas remain valid. In short, Mitchell was punished less for being wrong than for being disruptive in a rigid hierarchy. Despite these institutional obstacles, Mitchell sought to demonstrate the validity of his claims through practical demonstrations. One of the most notable of these was the 1921 bombing trials against captured German vessels, including the decommissioned battleship Ostfriesland. Aircraft sank the ship in a matter of hours, an event that shocked observers and confirmed Mitchell's assertion that air power could make traditional naval supremacy obsolete. Yet even in the face of tangible proof, the Navy and Army leadership were reluctant to embrace his conclusions. The demonstrations challenged not only technology, but also prestige and power structures within the military. Mitchell's victory over the Ostfriesland became emblematic of his career. A man vindicated by results, yet resisted by the institution he served. The public reaction to Mitchell's court-martial was complex. Newspapers across the country reported on the trial in detail, and editorials debated the merits of his arguments. Letters poured into the offices of Congress and the War Department, reflecting both admiration and condemnation. Many civilians saw him as a heroic figure, a man willing to challenge an inflexible bureaucracy in the service of national security. Critics, however, accused him of insubordination and recklessness. For advocates of air power, Mitchell's martyrdom became a rallying point, galvanizing support for the development of aviation and influencing policy debates for years to come. History ultimately vindicated Mitchell. By the time of World War II, the strategic importance of air power was undeniable. Aircraft dominated both tactical and strategic operations, destroying enemy fleets, supporting ground operations, and shaping the outcome of entire campaigns. The lessons Mitchell had emphasized, rapid technological adaptation, strategic bombing, and air mobility, were implemented on a scale that would have seemed impossible in the 1920s. Posthumously, Congress honored him, and historians recognized his as a visionary who had been punished not for error, but for challenging the inertia of military bureaucracy.
Mitchell's story also mirrors broader patterns in which truth-tellers are punished in their own time. Like Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers or whistleblowers who exposed atrocities during the Vietnam War, Mitchell exposed uncomfortable truth that threatened established power structures. Institutions act first to preserve order and authority. History often reassesses the value of their warnings only after events prove them accurate. Mitchell's foresight was ultimately validated, but only after a generation had witnessed the transformative power of air forces in modern conflict. His life offers enduring lessons about the tension between innovation and authority. Societies and institutions often punish those who challenge prevailing wisdom, particularly when those challenges are public and confrontational. Personality matters. Mitchell's abrasive style hastened his fall, but the deeper lesson is structural. Institutions protect themselves first and ideas second. For historians and military scholars, Mitchell serves as a case study in the costs and consequences of prophetic dissent. He demonstrates the moral and practical risks of speaking truth to power, but also the potential long-term influence of doing so. The United States Air Force, officially established in 1947, owes much to Mitchell's advocacy. Concepts such as strategic bombing, air superiority, and the integration of air power into national defense strategy trace their intellectual lineage to his arguments. Mitchell's insistence that the airplane was a transformative instrument of warfare influenced military thinkers like Curtis LeMay and Henry Hap Arnold, shaping doctrines that dominated World War II and the early Cold War. Even today, air power strategists reference Mitchell's demonstrations and speeches, studying both his foresight and the institutional resistance he faced. He remains a prominent figure in military academies, not simply as a historical curiosity, but as a template for understanding the interplay of technology, doctrine, and organizational politics. Billy Mitchell's life was a study in the hazards of prophetic dissent. He was punished, humiliated, and sidelined because his insights threatened the institution more than his personality alone. Yet history has vindicated him. The age of air power arrived precisely as he predicted. Mitchell's story is not simply about aviation. It is about the broader dynamics of human institutions. It illustrates a recurring pattern. Societies often label truth-tellers as troublemakers, particularly when those truths expose vulnerability or threaten existing power structures. Courts, bureaucracies, and hierarchies function as mechanisms of social control, sometimes at the expense of accuracy or innovation. Yet Mitchell also shows that individual courage can echo across decades. While the system punished him, his legacy endured, shaping strategies, technologies, and doctrines for future generations. The arc of history bends, in this case, toward vindication, reminding us that those who speak uncomfortable truths often do so at great personal cost, but their ideas may ultimately change the world.
Chapter 4. Ira Hayes, the reluctant flag raiser, and the country that failed him. On February 23, 1945, U.S. Marines climbed the slopes of Mount Suribachi during the ferocious battle for Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island whose strategic importance belied its size. Amid the smoke, ash, and deafening roar of artillery, a handful of Marines raised a flag that would come to symbolize not just the victory of a battle, but the steadfast determination and sacrifice of the American military in the Pacific Theater. Joe Rosenthal, a young Associated Press photographer, captured the moment in a single frame, and the photograph quickly became an icon, reproduced in newspapers, posters, and propaganda. Among the 6 men captured mid-gesture in that image was Ira Hayes, a Pima Native American from Arizona who had enlisted in the Marine Corps, leaving behind the arid expanses of the Gila River Indian Reservation for the uncertain dangers of war. Hayes had joined the Marines seeking purpose and adventure, but he found himself in circumstances that would test his endurance, courage, and humanity in ways no recruit could have anticipated. The photograph elevated Hayes to instantaneous fame, turning him into a symbol of American valor. Yet the reality of his experience contrasted sharply with the purity of the image. The flag raising itself was not a simple act of heroism. The battle for Iwo Jima had been brutal, with Marines facing relentless artillery, sniper fire, and entrenched Japanese forces willing to die rather than surrender. Hayes, like his comrades, had endured unimaginable conditions, scorching heat, volcanic ash, and the constant presence of death. He witnessed the loss of friends, the carnage of combat, and the random cruelty of warfare, experiences that left deep psychological scars long before the battle had concluded. Rosenthal's photograph captured a heroic tableau, yet it froze in time only a fraction of the human experience behind it. The exhaustion, fear, and moral weight carried by Hayes and the other Marines. When Hayes returned home, The country that had celebrated his image was ill-prepared to confront the man behind the myth. The American public, eager to see a tangible symbol of victory and resilience, embraced Hayes as a hero. He was enlisted in war bond drives and public appearances, his likeness plastered across posters urging citizens to support the war effort. Newspapers and magazines chronicled his life, yet the attention often felt transactional rather than supportive. The privileges and benefits typically associated with national heroes, a stable reintegration into society, financial support, recognition beyond imagery, were inconsistently applied. For Hayes, a young man already grappling with the dissonance between his tribal heritage and the mainstream society he served, this commodification of his persona was isolating. He struggled with post-traumatic stress, manifesting as insomnia, flashbacks, and a growing dependence on alcohol as a coping mechanism. The veneer of heroism imposed upon him by society clashed violently with his internal reality, deepening his sense of alienation. Beyond the psychological toll of combat, Hayes faced systemic obstacles rooted in race and culture. As a Native American, he returned to a society that routinely marginalized and discriminated against indigenous peoples. Opportunities for economic advancement were limited, social acceptance conditional, and institutional support often indifferent. Whereas the broader narrative celebrated a generalized, sanitized hero, the lived experience of Hayes involved navigating a society that had little interest in accommodating his complex identity or the wounds he carried from the battlefield. His difficulties were frequently misinterpreted as personal failings rather than as understandable responses to trauma and marginalization. The public, conditioned to see him through the lens of the photograph, judged his struggles harshly, expecting a seamless translation of battlefield courage into civilian comportment.
This expectation that heroism should extend from public feats to private perfection was a recurring theme in post-war America, particularly for minority veterans. Hayes's failure to conform to these standards invited scrutiny, criticism, and sometimes outright scorn. He was not court-martialed, nor formally punished for misconduct, yet the societal judgment he faced was profound. The dissonance between the man and the myth was stark, a figure revered in iconography yet neglected in actuality. Alcoholism and public missteps became markers of personal weakness in the eyes of observers, ignoring the profound psychological and social injuries inflicted by combat and compounded by systemic discrimination. Hayes's experiences highlighted a broader American tendency to elevate symbols while neglecting the human beings who embody them, a pattern that resonates in the treatment of other veterans, whistleblowers, and public figures who confront institutional or societal expectations. Comparisons can be drawn with other figures who suffered under similar dynamics, where the demands of public symbolism overshadowed the complexities of personal experience. Like Daniel Ellsberg, who faced public vilification for revealing uncomfortable truths about the Vietnam War, or Billy Mitchell, court-martialed for challenging prevailing military orthodoxy, Hayes encountered an institutional and cultural framework incapable of reconciling public image with private struggle. The mechanisms of society, media, political institutions, and public opinion often celebrated the idea of heroism while failing to provide the psychological, social, or material support necessary for its human agents to thrive. In each case, the discrepancy between societal expectation and personal reality resulted in marginalization, judgment, and, in some instances, tragic outcomes. Hayes's trajectory exemplifies this pattern with particular poignancy. The man who symbolized American fortitude on Iwo Jima became, in private life, a casualty of neglect and misunderstanding. The consequences of this neglect were stark and devastating. Hayes's alcoholism worsened over the years, his attempts at reintegration hampered by societal indifference and the lack of adequate support systems. He returned periodically to the Gila River Reservation, a place where he could find some sense of belonging, Yet the wounds of combat and cultural dislocation persisted. He experienced episodes of homelessness, and his life was punctuated by struggles that would have been mitigated had there been a coherent, empathetic framework for veteran support. By the time of his death in 1955, at the age of 32, Hayes had become a cautionary figure, a man whose valor was immortalized in one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, yet whose humanity was largely ignored. The photograph endured as an emblem of American resolve, while the man himself was mourned quietly by family and a few friends who understood the depth of his suffering.
Ira Hayes's story forces a difficult question. How should a nation treat those who come to embody its myths? The United States, in embracing his image while neglecting his person, demonstrated both the power and peril of symbolic heroism. Celebrated in public yet unsupported in private, Hayes exemplified the dangers of conflating image with reality. The systemic failures he endured, lack of adequate mental health care, societal discrimination, and the commodification of his persona underscore a broader responsibility that extends beyond hero worship, the duty to recognize, understand, and support the human costs behind the symbols. Without such recognition, the cycle repeats, as individuals are elevated, exploited, and then judged harshly when the burdens of their roles collide with private realities. Hayes's tragic life is a testament to this failure, a vivid illustration of the moral and psychological gaps that can emerge when a society venerates its icons without attending to their humanity. Ultimately, the image of Ira Hayes raising the flag on Mount Suribachi remains iconic, yet it should not obscure the complexity of his life or the injustice of his treatment. His story illustrates the collision between public expectation and personal reality, between symbolic immortality and human vulnerability. It reminds us that heroes, like all people, are shaped by their circumstances, and that societal admiration alone cannot heal the wounds of war, discrimination, or neglect. In reflecting on Hayes, the nation confronts not only the glory of its military achievements, but also the moral cost of ignoring those who serve. His life, marked by courage, suffering, and ultimate tragedy, serves as both a historical lesson and a moral challenge, to honor not only the image of heroism, but the person who carries it. The enduring lesson of Ira Hayes is painfully clear. A nation may celebrate a symbol without recognizing the human being beneath it, but such celebration is incomplete, hollow, and ultimately unjust. To truly honor those who embody a country's highest ideals requires more than photographs, ceremonies, or propaganda. It demands empathy, support, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the costs of war, the weight of societal expectations, and the consequences of systemic neglect. Hayes's life, though tragically short, compels reflection on these issues and challenges every society that elevates heroes to ensure that the human beings behind the myth are neither forgotten nor abandoned.
Chapter 5. Smedley Butler, the Marine who denounced war profiteering and was marginalized. Smedley Butler's life offers one of the most striking and unsettling examples of a soldier whose reputation for bravery and service was turned against him when he chose to confront uncomfortable truths. Born in 1881 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Butler entered a nation still navigating its role on the global stage. The United States was emerging from a period of continental consolidation and was increasingly projecting power abroad. Butler's own career would become entwined with this expansion, and his trajectory would expose both the glories and the moral contradictions of American militarism in the early 20th century. As a young man, Butler joined the Marine Corps, a decision that would place him at the forefront of nearly every major American military engagement during his early career. He fought in the Spanish-American War, a conflict that thrust the United States into imperial ambitions in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It was in Cuba,
that Butler's skill and courage were first recognized as he distinguished himself under fire. The Spanish-American War, while often celebrated in American popular memory as a brief and decisive conflict, was also the first instance where Butler began to see the darker intersections of warfare and private interests. Soldiers like him risked life and limb, yet the strategic and economic motivations driving these conflicts were largely invisible to the rank and file. Butler's career continued in the Philippine-American War, a campaign marked by brutal counterinsurgency operations. The Philippines presented a complex and morally ambiguous battlefield. American forces were ostensibly there to liberate the islands from Spanish rule, but the reality was the establishment of American colonial control, often enforced through harsh measures against local populations. Butler, by all accounts, carried out his duties with distinction, earning not only the respect of his peers, but also the admiration of his superiors. He was awarded his first Medal of Honor for heroism in the Philippine campaign, a symbol of valor that few in the Corps ever attained. Yet it was during this period that Butler's first-hand exposure to the consequences of military actions planted the seeds of his later descent. The trajectory of his service saw him engaged in multiple other conflicts, interventions in Central America, the so-called Banana Wars in Haiti, Nicaragua, and other nations where the Marines were used as instruments of both military and corporate policy. The term Banana Wars belies the seriousness of these interventions. American forces, often under orders that blurred the lines between diplomacy, defense, and corporate protection, suppressed uprisings, safeguarded foreign investments, and enforced policies that benefited American commercial interests. Butler himself came to witness the intersections of money, power, and military might in ways that would later crystallize into his famous critique. These experiences, repeated over decades, cultivated an awareness that the mechanisms of war often served profit rather than principle.
By the time Butler rose to the rank of Major General, one of the highest in the Marine Corps, his reputation was unmatched. He was not only a decorated officer, but also an insider with intimate knowledge of the military-industrial complex in its early stages. Yet rather than using this prestige to secure comfort or further advancement, Butler would take an unexpected turn. He began speaking openly about the moral hazards of war as an enterprise. In his 1935 speech and subsequent book, War is a Racket, Butler argued that wars were not primarily fought for national defense or ideals, but for the financial benefit of a few private entities. He described war as an industry in which bankers, industrialists, and politicians profited, while ordinary soldiers suffered. His language was direct, unsparing, and deeply informed by decades of personal experience. He had seen the machinery of war from the inside, and he was prepared to call it what he saw. Butler's critique was not merely theoretical. He cited concrete examples: the profits earned by munitions manufacturers, the enrichment of corporations through foreign interventions, and the systemic ways in which ordinary citizens bore the human and economic costs. By invoking his own military record as evidence, he preempted dismissals of ignorance or ideological bias. He was a soldier speaking from authority, and this made his denunciations particularly uncomfortable for the establishments he implicated. The reaction to Butler's claims was swift and telling. The military and political elites could not simply ignore him, but neither could they confront him directly without risk of undermining the public image of the armed forces. Instead, they marginalized him. Newspapers questioned his sanity, politicians hinted at disloyalty, and social commentary framed his critiques as unpatriotic. His medals and rank did not shield him. In fact, they may have amplified the threat he posed, because no ordinary critic could claim the credibility that a two-time Medal of Honor recipient did. Butler's involvement in the so-called business plot of 1934 further inflamed controversy. He testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities
that a group of wealthy businessmen had approached him to lead a coup against President Franklin D. Roosevelt, ostensibly to protect corporate interests threatened by the New Deal policies. He described the plot with specificity, naming some of the participants and outlining the proposed methods. The committee investigated and acknowledged the plausibility of his claims, but the broader public response was muted, framed as the ramblings of a retired general, were dismissed as sensationalism. The political settlement of the time effectively buried the scandal, and Butler's testimony was not sufficient to provoke widespread reform. Butler's involvement in the so-called business plot of 1934 further inflamed controversy. He testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities that a group of wealthy businessmen had approached him to lead a coup against President Franklin D. Roosevelt, ostensibly to protect corporate interests threatened by the New Deal policies. He described the plot with specificity, naming some of the participants and outlining the proposed methods. The committee investigated and acknowledged the plausibility of his claims, but the broader public response was muted, framed as the ramblings of a retired general, were dismissed as sensationalism. The political settlement of the time effectively buried the scandal, and Butler's testimony was not sufficient to provoke widespread reform. Butler's critique did not go unnoticed among some segments of the public and intellectual community. He influenced pacifists, reformers, and critics of American foreign policy, providing a template for thinking about military-industrial entanglements. His insistence on connecting war to financial incentives prefigured later discussions about the military-industrial complex, most famously articulated by President Dwight Eisenhower 2 decades later. Yet for much of his lifetime, Butler's warnings were sidelined. The economic and political structures he criticized were resilient, able to absorb individual dissent without substantive change. The arc of Butler's life exemplifies the tension between personal integrity and institutional loyalty. Unlike careerists who maintain silence to protect rank, reputation, or pension, Butler chose confrontation, knowing the personal and professional consequences. His story resonates because it is neither purely heroic nor naively righteous. It is complicated by decades of service, by the very accomplishments that lent him authority, and by the messy realities of American expansionism. He was a man who had fought for his country and then turned that service into a lens through which to critique it, a rare combination that made him both respected and reviled. Comparisons with other historical figures reveal a recurring pattern. Like Billy Mitchell, another military officer who criticized strategic and political mismanagement, Butler illustrates how insider knowledge can transform into public dissent. In both cases, the institutions they served were threatened not by action in battle, but by moral clarity and the willingness to speak truth to power. The reaction of society and government, marginalization, ridicule, bureaucratic obstruction, is consistent across these narratives, highlighting the structural barriers that confront those who seek to hold powerful actors accountable.
Butler's later years were quieter, but no less reflective. He continued to speak, write, and advocate for a vision of national policy grounded in restraint, justice, and transparency. Though his influence was limited in immediate political terms, his ideas endured, seeping into broader conversations about war, profit, and the ethical obligations of nations. Historians and commentators today recognize Butler not as a fringe figure, but as a prophetic critic whose warnings were ignored at peril. In sum, Smedley Butler's life and career exemplify the complex interplay between valor, morality, and dissent. He navigated the highest echelons of military power, witnessed firsthand the brutal consequences of American interventions abroad, and then chose to speak against the very system that had elevated him. His experiences reveal how structures of power protect themselves, often at the expense of truth,
and how individual courage can illuminate patterns of exploitation that remain hidden from the public eye. Butler's story is not a tale of simple heroism. It is a study in ethical responsibility, the costs of dissent, and the enduring tension between conscience and institution. It is ultimately a reminder that moral clarity in the face of entrenched interests is both rare and dangerous, and that history often remembers the whistleblower long after the immediacy of scandal has faded. Smedley Butler died in 1940, his warnings largely unheeded by contemporaries. Yet his legacy persists. War is a racket remains a touchstone for those who question the relationship between economic interests and military action. His life offers an analytical lens through which to understand not only the early 20th century United States, but also the perennial conflicts between ethical conviction and institutional imperatives. Butler's story stands as a testament to the enduring human struggle to reconcile duty, morality, and truth, and to the high personal cost that comes with the courage to confront powerful forces.